September 19th, 1942, South Atlantic Ocean. 300 miles from the coast of Brazil. A cargo ship cuts through dark water under a moonless sky. She is running without lights, as regulations now require, her hull painted in dull grey to blend with the ocean, her presence known only to those who sent her and those who are hunting her. The war has turned the Atlantic into a killing ground, and every vessel that crosses these waters does so with the knowledge that survival is not guaranteed, that the ocean floor is already littered with ships that departed port and simply never arrived, their disappearances noted in ledgers and mourned by families, but never explained, never resolved, their final moments witnessed only by the men who died, and the sea that swallowed them. The ship carries a crew of 73 men and a cargo that will not be catalogued in any public record, that exists only in classified manifests locked in safes in New York and London and Washington, a cargo valuable enough to justify the risk of crossing an ocean, patrolled by submarines but not valuable enough to warrant the protection of a naval escort. For in 1942, the navies of the Allied powers are stretched impossibly thin, assigned to protect troop transports and oil tankers and munitions, ships and a cargo vessel, however valuable her contents, must take her chances alone. The men aboard know what they are carrying, or at least they know enough to understand that their ship is a target, that somewhere beneath the surface German U-boats are prowling, listening, waiting for the sound of engines that will betray a vessel's position and allow the firing of torpedoes that will send her to the bottom in minutes, and this knowledge shapes every moment of the voyage, creates a tension that cannot be released, a vigilance that exhausts without protecting. The cargo in the holds below deck includes 48 tons of silver bars, refined and stamped and stacked in wooden crates, destined for banks in India, where they will be used to stabilize currency and finance the war effort in Asia, to pay soldiers and purchase supplies, and maintain the financial architecture that allows Britain to project power across a subcontinent it has ruled for nearly 2 centuries. The silver has been loaded with extraordinary care, positioned low in the ship to maintain stability, secured against the possibility of shifting during rough weather, insured for a sum that represents a fortune by any measure, but that pales in comparison to the strategic value of maintaining British control over Indian finances during a period of unprecedented strain. Beside the silver, occupying other sections of the cargo holds, are 117 automobiles, brand new Ford and Chevrolet models that were manufactured in Detroit and intended for sale in South American markets, civilian vehicles that seem absurdly out of place in a world at war, but that represent valuable assets nonetheless, products of American industrial capacity that can be converted into currency or traded for resources that support the war effort in ways that never appear in official histories. The ship herself is unremarkable, a standard cargo vessel built in the late 1932, designed for commerce rather than conflict, pressed into wartime service like thousands of other merchant ships whose peacetime routes across the Atlantic have been transformed into supply lines that must be defended at all costs. For Britain is an island that imports most of what it needs to survive and the interruption of those imports through submarine warfare represents an existential threat that could decide the outcome of the war more decisively than any battle fought on land. She is not fast enough to outrun submarines, not armed heavily enough to fight them, not maneuverable enough to evade torpedoes if they are fired from close range, and her only defense is the vastness of the ocean itself, the possibility that she might cross thousands of miles of water without encountering an enemy, that the U-boats hunting in these waters might be stationed elsewhere or distracted by other targets, or simply unlucky in their search patterns. But luck is not a strategy, and on the night of September 19th, 1942, as the ship maintains her course through the South Atlantic, moving at a steady 12 knots toward a destination she will never reach, a German submarine operating several hundred miles off the Brazilian coast detects the distinctive sound of her engines through hydrophones, the rhythmic throb of reciprocating machinery that carries through water far more effectively than through air, and the submarine's commander, a veteran of dozens of successful attacks who has sent more than 50,000 tons of Allied shipping to the bottom, orders his vessel to pursue, to close the distance between hunter and prey, to position the submarine for a torpedo attack that will add one more ship to the tally of destruction that defines his career and contributes to Germany's strategic objective of starving Britain into submission. The cargo ship's crew maintains their watch, scanning the horizon for shapes that should not be there, listening for sounds that might indicate danger, following protocols that have been developed through bitter experience, through the analysis of thousands of attacks and the testimony of survivors who managed to escape sinking vessels. But these protocols offer no guarantee, provide no certainty, for the ocean is too large and the submarines too small and the darkness too complete, and men can stand watch for hours without seeing anything and then die moments later when a torpedo strikes without warning, the explosion tearing through steel plating and flooding compartments and sending the ship down before lifeboats can be launched or distress signals transmitted. The submarine closes to within 3,000 yards, a distance carefully calculated to maximize the probability of a hit while minimizing the risk of detection, and at precisely 11:42 in the evening, local time, the commander gives the order to fire, and 2 torpedoes leave their tubes and begin their run toward the cargo ship, their electric motors propelling them through the water at 45 knots, their guidance systems keeping them on course toward the target, their warheads armed and ready to detonate on contact with the hull. The first torpedo strikes the ship amidships, below the waterline, on the starboard side, and the explosion is catastrophic, not because the warhead is particularly large, but because it ruptures fuel tanks and ignites the oil stored within, creating a secondary blast that tears through bulkheads and sends flames racing through passageways and transforms the interior of the ship into an inferno within seconds. Men who are sleeping in their bunks wake to find their compartments filling with smoke and water simultaneously, the ship listing heavily to starboard as the ocean pours through the massive hole torn in her side, the electrical systems failing and plunging everything into darkness, the emergency lighting inadequate to navigate corridors that have become mazes of twisted metal and broken pipes and obstacles that were not there minutes before. The second torpedo, fired 12 seconds after the first, strikes near the bow, and this explosion, though it produces less fire, causes more structural damage, breaking the ship's back, fracturing the keel that holds her together, ensuring that even if the crew could somehow control the flooding and extinguish the fires, the vessel herself is finished, that she will break apart and sink within the hour. The captain, who has survived one previous sinking and knows exactly what is happening, immediately orders the crew to abandon ship. But this order, though clear and correct, cannot be fully executed, for the lifeboats on the starboard side are now hanging at impossible angles as the ship lists, unusable without elaborate rigging that there is no time to arrange, and the boats on the port side, though accessible, are insufficient to carry the entire crew, and so choices must be made, decisions that will determine who lives and who dies, who gets a place in a boat and who must take his chances in the water with a life jacket that may or may not keep him afloat until rescue arrives, if rescue arrives at all, for the ship has not had time to transmit a distress signal, has not been able to report her position or the nature of the attack. And the ocean is vast, and the nearest land is hundreds of miles away, and the chances of survival for men in the water, even in the relatively warm temperatures of the South Atlantic, diminish rapidly with each passing hour. 47 men make it into lifeboats before the ship begins her final plunge, the bow already submerged and the stern rising out of the water at an angle that grows steeper with each passing moment, the propeller blades exposed to the air and the rudder useless. The entire vessel groaning with stresses that no ship is designed to withstand, metal tearing and rivets popping and seams splitting as the structure fails comprehensively, and then at 12:17 in the morning of September 20th, 1942, 35 minutes after the first torpedo struck, the ship slides beneath the surface stern first, leaving behind only debris and oil and men struggling in the water, some of whom will be pulled into lifeboats, and some of whom will drown before help can reach them, and some of whom will survive the night only to die of exposure or thirst in the days that follow. For the ocean is not merciful, and rescue is never certain, and the distance between life and death in such circumstances is measured in luck as much as skill or preparation. 26 men die that night, either in the initial explosions or in the water afterward. Their bodies never recovered, their graves unmarked except by the coordinates of the sinking, which are recorded in the submarine commander's log but which will not be made public for decades, will remain classified long after the war ends, will be forgotten by everyone except the families of the men who died and the handful of survivors who carry the memory of that night for the rest of their lives. The lifeboats carrying the 47 survivors drift for 3 days before being spotted by a Brazilian patrol vessel that has been searching the area after receiving reports of submarine activity, and the men are brought ashore and debriefed and eventually return to their home ports. But they are ordered not to discuss the details of the sinking, not to mention the cargo they were carrying, not to speculate about why their ship was targeted or what strategic value its loss might have had, for in wartime such information is classified and its dissemination is considered a threat to security, and so the survivors remain silent, and the sinking is recorded in official files that are sealed, and the ship herself is forgotten, her name removed from active registries, her loss noted in statistical compilations of merchant vessel casualties, but never investigated in detail, never examined for lessons that might prevent similar losses in the future. The cargo, 48 tons of silver and 117 automobiles and various other materials whose exact nature was never fully catalogued, sinks with the ship, falling through 3 miles of water, descending through zones where sunlight penetrates, and then through deeper layers where darkness is absolute, and the pressure increases to levels that would crush any human being instantly, tumbling through the water column until it reaches the abyssal plain, the vast flat expanse of sediment and rock that covers most of the ocean floor, coming to rest in a position that will remain unchanged for nearly 70 years, the silver bars still in their wooden crates, the automobiles still strapped to their shipping pallets, the entire cargo preserved by the cold and the darkness and the absence of oxygen that prevents corrosion and decay, transformed from valuable commodities into archaeological artifacts by the simple fact of their inaccessibility, their removal from the world of commerce and war into a realm where human presence is impossible and human concerns irrelevant. For decades, the wreck remains unknown, its location marked only by entries in classified documents that are read by historians and researchers, but that provide insufficient detail to allow the ship to be found, the coordinates recorded in the submarine commander's log accurate only to within several miles, an area that covers hundreds of square miles of ocean floor and that cannot be searched effectively with the technology available in the immediate post-war period. And so the ship becomes another mystery, another vessel that disappeared during the war and whose fate is known in general terms but not in specific detail, another name on a list of losses that grows so long during 6 years of conflict that individual ships cease to matter except to those who served on them or lost family members aboard them. The silver, which was insured and whose loss was compensated by insurance companies in transactions that were settled years before the war ended, is written off, removed from balance sheets, being forgotten by everyone except a few specialists in maritime salvage who occasionally wonder whether it might be worth attempting recovery, but who conclude that the cost and technical difficulty of working at such depths make any salvage operation economically unviable, that the silver would have to be worth far more than its weight to justify the expense of retrieving it from 3 miles below the surface. The decades pass, and the ship rests undisturbed, her hull slowly settling into the sediment, her superstructure collapsing as metal fatigues and corrosion works its way through rivets and welds. Her cargo holds becoming chambers sealed against the outside world by layers of rust and biological growth, her identity gradually eroding as paint flakes away and nameplates deteriorate, and the features that once distinguished her from other vessels of her class disappear into the uniformity of decay. The world above changes dramatically during these years. The war ends, and the Cold War begins, and technology advances in ways that would have seemed miraculous to the men who sailed on the ship in 1942. And among these advances are new capabilities in deep-sea exploration, the development of remotely operated vehicles and sophisticated sonar systems and mapping technologies that allow researchers to survey the ocean floor with a precision that was previously impossible, to locate objects that would have remained lost forever in an earlier era, to transform the deep ocean from an inaccessible void into a landscape that can be studied and documented, and in some cases, economically exploited. In 2011, a commercial salvage company conducting a survey of the South Atlantic as part of a broader effort to locate and catalogue historically significant wrecks, detects an anomaly on the ocean floor, a shape that does not match the natural topography, a mass of metal that appears too regular and too large to be geological in origin. And the company deploys a remotely operated vehicle to investigate, sending the device down through the water column, through the layers of light and darkness, through zones inhabited by creatures that have never seen the surface and never will, until it reaches the bottom and begins transmitting video footage back to the surface ship, images that show a wreck lying on its side, partially buried in sediment, surrounded by debris that has scattered across hundreds of yards of ocean floor. And as the vehicle moves closer and its cameras focus on specific details, as the hull plating comes into view and the remains of the superstructure can be examined and the cargo holds reveal their contents, it becomes clear that this is not just any wreck, but a vessel that has been lost since World War II. A time capsule from an era when the Atlantic was a battlefield and merchant ships were targets, and the outcome of the war depended in part on whether supplies could be moved across the ocean faster than submarines could sink them. The remotely operated vehicle maneuvers through the wreck with extraordinary care, its operators on the surface ship controlling its movements with joysticks and watching the video feed with growing astonishment, for what they are seeing contradicts their expectations about what a shipwreck 70 years old should look like, what condition its cargo should be in, what state of preservation is possible at such depths and in such darkness. The silver bars are still in their crates, the wood partially rotted but the metal beneath completely intact. The bars stacked exactly as they were loaded in 1942, their surfaces covered with a thin layer of sediment but otherwise unchanged, as if they had been placed in storage rather than lost at sea. And the sight of this silver, this fortune in precious metal lying on the ocean floor 3 miles below the surface, immediately raises questions about ownership and salvage rights, and whether recovery is technically feasible and economically justified, questions that will occupy lawyers and salvage companies and insurance companies and government agencies for years, and that will never be fully resolved to everyone's satisfaction. But it is not the silver that shocks the salvage team, not the monetary value of the cargo that captures their attention and eventually makes this discovery significant beyond the usual parameters of maritime archaeology and commercial salvage for the remotely operated vehicle, as it continues its survey of the wreck, moving from the cargo holds where the silver is stored into other sections of the ship, reveals something that no one expected, something that seems impossible given the circumstances of the sinking and the decades that have passed since. Something that transforms the wreck from a valuable find into a phenomenon that challenges assumptions about how the deep ocean preserves what falls into it. In one of the forward holds, secured to their shipping pallets with chains and straps that have corroded but not failed, are the automobiles, the Ford and Chevrolet models that were being transported to South American markets. And these vehicles, though covered in sediment and biological growth, though showing signs of corrosion on exposed metal surfaces, are remarkably intact. Their basic structures preserved by the cold water and the absence of oxygen, their tires still inflated, their windshields still in place. their interiors still containing the seats and steering wheels and dashboard instruments that were installed in Detroit assembly plants in early 1942, and the sight of these cars, these artifacts of American industrial production, resting on the ocean floor in perfect rows as if waiting for customers who will never come, creates a visual impact that transcends the monetary value of the silver or the historical significance of the wreck. The images transmitted by the remotely operated vehicle are recorded and analyzed and eventually released to the public, though not immediately, for the salvage company is careful to establish its legal claims to the wreck before revealing too much information about what has been found, and when the photographs and video footage do finally appear, published in maritime journals and picked up by news organizations and circulated on the internet, they generate a response that surprises even those who discovered the wreck. For there is something profoundly unsettling about seeing these cars preserved at the bottom of the ocean, something that speaks to the randomness of history and the way in which valuable objects can be removed from circulation and hidden away in places where they serve no purpose. Something that reminds viewers that beneath the surface of the ocean there exists a parallel world, littered with the remnants of human activity, a graveyard of ships and planes and cargo that has accumulated over centuries, and that represents not merely loss, but a kind of erasure, the removal of things from the realm of the useful into the realm of the forgotten. The salvage company spends months developing plans to recover the cargo, consulting with engineers and lawyers and insurance companies, calculating costs and assessing risks, and negotiating agreements with various parties who claim ownership or jurisdiction or a right to participate in any recovery operation. But as these discussions proceed, it becomes increasingly clear that the technical challenges of working at such depths are formidable, that the equipment needed to lift heavy cargo from 3 miles below the surface is expensive and specialized and not readily available, that the weather in the South Atlantic is unpredictable and the window for safe operations limited, that the whole endeavor would require an investment running into tens of millions of dollars with no guarantee of success, and gradually the initial enthusiasm for recovery gives way to a more sober assessment of what is actually feasible, what makes economic sense, what can be accomplished given the constraints of technology and finance and international law. The silver, despite its value, remains on the ocean floor, deemed too expensive to recover, the cost of salvage exceeding the worth of the metal even at premium prices, and the automobiles, which have no monetary value whatsoever except perhaps as curiosities, are left where they rest, preserved in the cold darkness as museum pieces that will never be viewed except through the cameras of remotely operated vehicles, monuments to a moment in industrial history when American factories were producing vehicles for export even as they prepared to convert their production lines to military equipment, to tanks and trucks and aircraft, to the machinery of war that would eventually help defeat the submarines that hunted in the Atlantic and sank ships like this one. The wreck itself is catalogued and mapped and added to databases maintained by organizations that track historically significant sites, and its location is noted in publications read by maritime historians and archaeologists and salvage specialists. But beyond this documentation, nothing changes. The ship remains where it sank, the cargo remains in the holds, the automobiles remain on their pallets, and the ocean continues its slow work of transformation, covering everything with sediment, encouraging the growth of organisms that feed on the nutrients that accumulate around wrecks, gradually incorporating this human artifact into the ecosystem of the deep sea. There are other ships down there, thousands of them. Wrecks from every era of maritime history scattered across the ocean floor, in patterns that reflect trade routes and migration paths and the locations of naval battles. And among these wrecks are others that carried valuable cargo, gold and silver and gems and artwork and materials, whose worth was calculated in currencies that no longer exist, and most of these cargoes will never be recovered, will remain lost not because their locations are unknown, but because the economics of salvage do not justify the effort required to bring them to the surface. Because the deep ocean has proven to be a more effective vault than any built by human hands, a place where valuable things can be stored indefinitely without risk of theft, but also without any possibility of use, removed from circulation as thoroughly as if they had been destroyed. The ship that sank in 1942, carrying silver and automobiles, is unusual only in that it has been found and documented, only in that we know what it contains and where it rests. But in every other respect, it is typical of hundreds of similar wrecks, vessels that were sunk during the war and that carried cargo that was valuable then and that remains valuable now, but that has been effectively removed from the world, placed beyond reach in a realm where human presence is possible only through machines, where recovery is technically feasible but economically prohibitive, where the past can be observed but not retrieved. The families of the men who died when the ship sank have mostly passed away themselves by the time the wreck is discovered. The few surviving relatives too old to take much interest in the details of how their fathers or grandfathers or great-grandfathers died. The connection to that event attenuated by time and the deaths of those who remembered it directly, and so there is no constituency demanding that the wreck be treated as a war grave, no group insisting that it should remain undisturbed out of respect for the dead, no organized effort to commemorate the sinking or ensure that the men who died are remembered, and in the absence of such pressure, the wreck is treated as what it is, a commercial asset whose value is defined by the market price of its cargo and the cost of recovery, a calculation that determines its fate more decisively than any consideration of historical significance or human tragedy. The discovery of the wreck raises questions that extend beyond the specific circumstances of this particular ship, questions about what lies beneath the surface of the ocean, and what it means that we are only now developing the technology to explore these depths systematically, questions about how much of human history has been lost to the sea and how much of what was lost might eventually be found, questions about whether finding these wrecks and documenting their contents actually constitutes recovery in any meaningful sense, or whether it simply transforms one kind of loss into another, the physical inaccessibility of the cargo replaced by the legal and economic barriers that prevent its salvage. The ocean floor is a repository of things that were once valuable and that may still be valuable in some abstract sense, but that have been removed from use, placed in a state of permanent storage that serves no purpose except to preserve them from complete destruction. And as our ability to locate and document these things improves, as the inventory of what lies beneath the surface grows longer and more detailed, we are forced to confront the reality that finding something and recovering it are very different achievements. That knowledge of where something is does not necessarily translate into the ability to retrieve it. That the ocean gives up its secrets reluctantly and demands payment for every artifact brought back to the surface. The ship that vanished in 1942, that was rediscovered in 2011, that still rests on the ocean floor with its cargo of silver and automobiles intact, represents more than a wartime loss or a salvage opportunity or a historical curiosity. It represents a moment frozen in time, a snapshot of industrial civilization at a point of maximum stress, when factories were running at full capacity to produce both civilian goods and military equipment, when the Atlantic was a contested space, where the outcome of the war was being decided by the ability of merchant ships to deliver their cargo despite submarine attacks, when silver was being shipped across oceans to stabilize currencies and finance military operations in distant theaters, when ordinary commercial transactions were caught up in the machinery of global conflict and transformed into strategic calculations that determined the allocation of resources and the movement of materials across continents, oceans. The cargo in the ship's holds is valuable, certainly worth millions of dollars at current prices, enough to justify considerable effort and expense if recovery were economically feasible, but its true significance lies not in its monetary worth, but in what it represents about the world that created it, and the world that lost it, and the world that has now found it again. The silver was refined and stamped and shipped because governments needed to maintain financial systems that were being strained by the demands of total war, because currencies had to be backed by precious metals to maintain confidence, because the mechanisms of international finance required physical assets that could be moved and stored and counted, and the fact that this silver ended up on the ocean floor rather than in bank vaults in India represents a failure of the systems designed to protect it, a breakdown in the elaborate infrastructure of convoy routes and naval escorts and intelligence gathering that was supposed to ensure the safe passage of strategic cargo. The automobiles, those Fords and Chevrolets that still sit on their pallets in the forward hold, represent something different, a peacetime commerce that continued even as war consumed more and more of the world's productive capacity, a civilian economy that persisted in the spaces between military priorities, an export trade that moved consumer goods from American factories to foreign markets despite the risks involved, and the preservation of these vehicles in the cold darkness of the deep ocean creates a strange juxtaposition, an image of normalcy suspended in a context of violence and destruction. Cars that were built for driving on roads now resting on the floor of the Atlantic, their purpose negated by the circumstances of their loss, but their form preserved as if waiting for conditions to change and use to become possible again. The wreck lies in darkness, 3 miles below the surface, beyond the reach of sunlight, beyond the zone where most marine life exists, in a region of the ocean that remains largely unexplored despite all our technological advances. And this darkness is appropriate somehow, for the ship and its cargo have passed from the realm of the visible into the realm of the invisible, from the world of commerce and war into the world of memory and speculation, from the present into the past. And though we can now locate it and document it and even, in theory, recover its cargo, we cannot restore it to its original purpose, cannot undo the sinking or save the men who died or deliver the silver to its intended destination or sell the automobiles to the customers who were waiting for them in 1942. What we have instead is knowledge, the awareness that these things exist, that they rest on the ocean floor in a specific location, that they are preserved in a state that allows us to see them much as they were when they sank. And this knowledge changes nothing and everything, for it tells us where something is. Without giving us the ability to retrieve it, it shows us what was lost without providing any means to recover it. It transforms absence into presence without actually making the thing present. And in this transformation, we encounter one of the fundamental paradoxes of historical research, which is that increasing our knowledge about the past does not necessarily increase our ability to change the present or influence the future. That knowing where something is and knowing what it is does not automatically translate into possession or use or benefit. The ship that vanished in 1942 and was found in 2011 remains lost in every practical sense, its cargo inaccessible, its value unrealized, its contents serving no purpose except to satisfy curiosity and provide evidence for historical research, and this condition is likely to persist indefinitely. For the economics of deep-sea salvage are unlikely to change dramatically enough to make recovery feasible, the technology required is unlikely to become cheap enough to justify the expense, the legal complexities are unlikely to be resolved in ways that allow salvage operations to proceed without extensive litigation, and so the silver will remain in its crates, and the automobiles will remain on their pallets, and the wreck will continue to rest on the ocean floor, slowly being covered by sediment, gradually being incorporated into the landscape, eventually becoming indistinguishable from the natural features that surround it. And perhaps this is appropriate. Perhaps this is the fate that such things deserve, to be preserved but not recovered, to be known but not possessed, to exist in a state between presence and absence that denies the possibility of use while confirming the fact of existence. For there is something fitting about the idea that the ocean, which has always taken what falls into it and rarely given anything back, should serve as a permanent repository for the excess of industrial civilization, for the materials and products and cargo that were deemed valuable enough to transport across thousands of miles of dangerous water, but not valuable enough to protect adequately for the silver and automobiles and countless other things that now rest in darkness 3 miles below the surface, preserved by cold and pressure and absence of oxygen, waiting for conditions that will never arrive, for a recovery that will never happen, for a future that cannot include them except as memories and images and data points in catalogues of loss. The discovery of the wreck was reported in news outlets and discussed in maritime journals and noted in academic publications, and then largely forgotten, displaced by more recent discoveries and more urgent concerns, and this forgetting is also appropriate. For the ship has already been forgotten once, has already passed from active memory into archival obscurity, and its brief return to attention through the accident of its rediscovery does not change its fundamental status as a relic from a war that ended more than 70 years ago, as a commercial vessel that failed to deliver its cargo and paid for that failure with the lives of 26 men, as a collection of valuable materials that have been removed from circulation and placed beyond the possibility of use. The ocean is full of such things, full of ships that sank and cargoes that were lost and men who died, and we are only beginning to develop the capacity to find them and document them and understand what they represent. But this capacity does not extend to recovery or resurrection or redemption, only to knowledge, only to the awareness that these things exist somewhere beneath the surface, resting in darkness, preserved in cold water, waiting for nothing because there is nothing to wait for. The automobiles in the forward hold have been underwater for more than 70 years now, their metal corroded but their structures intact, their tires still holding air that was compressed in 1942, their interiors still containing the materials and components that were installed on assembly lines in Detroit at a time when the war was expanding to consume the entire world. And if it were somehow possible to bring one of these vehicles to the surface and restore it to working condition, if the technical challenges could be overcome and the expense justified and the legal obstacles surmounted, the car would start and run and drive as it was designed to do, would function exactly as it would have functioned if it had reached its destination and been sold to a customer and put into service on South American roads. But this possibility, though technically real, is practically impossible, for the cost of recovery would exceed the value of the car by orders of magnitude. And so the vehicle remains where it is, serving no function except to exist, to be preserved, to wait in a darkness that will never lift and a cold that will never warm. This is what the ocean does with the things that fall into it, the ships and planes and cargo and debris that sink below the surface and settle on the floor. It preserves them in a state between existence and non-existence, between presence and absence, maintaining their form while denying their function. And as our technology improves and our ability to explore these depths increases, we discover more and more of these preserved things, these artifacts from past eras that exist in a realm we can observe but cannot easily access. And each discovery raises the same questions about what it means to find something that cannot be recovered, to know where something is without being able to retrieve it, to possess knowledge without being able to translate that knowledge into action or benefit. The ship lies in darkness, the silver rests in its crates, the automobiles wait on their pallets, and this configuration will likely persist for centuries, for the ocean protects what it takes and rarely surrenders what it holds, and those who look at the images transmitted by remotely operated vehicles, who see these preserved artifacts resting on the ocean floor 3 miles below the surface, are left to contemplate the strange fate of valuable things removed from circulation, placed in storage that serves no purpose, maintained in a state that allows no use, and to wonder what it means that we live in a world where such things exist, where the past is preserved but not accessible, where history accumulates on the ocean floor in layers that can be documented but not disturbed, where the most valuable cargo sometimes lies in the deepest water, visible but unreachable, known but lost. The remotely operated vehicle that first surveyed the wreck in 2011 returned to the site multiple times over the following months, its cameras documenting every accessible section of the ship measuring dimensions and cataloguing visible cargo and creating three-dimensional maps that allow researchers to study the wreck without descending to the ocean floor themselves. And these surveys reveal details that would have been impossible to discern from a single visit, patterns of corrosion and structural failure that indicate how the ship broke apart as it sank, evidence of how the cargo shifted during the descent and where it came to rest, insights into the physical processes that govern preservation at such depths. The vehicle's manipulator arms collected samples of the sediment surrounding the wreck, extracting cores that contain layers deposited over decades. And analysis of these cores provides a timeline of the wreck's gradual incorporation into the seafloor environment, shows how marine organisms colonized the artificial reef created by the ship's structure, reveals the chemical processes by which steel corrodes in the absence of oxygen, and how wood degrades when protected from the organisms that normally consume it. What these surveys demonstrated, beyond the specific details of this particular wreck, is that the deep ocean is not a uniform environment, but rather a complex system with local variations in temperature and current and chemistry that affect how objects are preserved. That a wreck lying in one location might be almost perfectly intact, while a similar wreck only a few miles away might be reduced to a barely recognizable pile of debris, that predicting the condition of underwater artifacts requires understanding not just how long they have been submerged, but where they are located and what specific conditions prevail at that location. The ship that sank in 1942 came to rest in an area of the South Atlantic where the water is particularly cold and still, where currents are minimal and sediment accumulation is slow, where the chemistry of the water creates conditions that inhibit corrosion and biological activity, and these factors combined to preserve the wreck and its cargo in a state that surprised even experienced salvage professionals who had seen hundreds of shipwrecks and thought they understood the limits of what the ocean preserves. The automobiles, in particular, defied expectations, for conventional wisdom held that complex manufactured objects with multiple materials and components would not survive prolonged immersion intact, that the different rates at which steel and rubber and glass and fabric deteriorate would cause such objects to fall apart, that the mechanical systems would seize and the structural integrity would fail, and the whole would become less than the sum of its parts. But the cars in the cargo hold have not followed this pattern, have remained recognizably what they are, have retained their essential character despite decades of submersion, and this preservation raises questions about what other artifacts might be waiting in the deep ocean. What other manufactured goods from various historical periods might be resting on the seafloor in conditions that allow their survival? What inventory of industrial production has been lost to the sea and might eventually be discovered and documented as exploration technology continues to improve? The silver, being a relatively inert metal, presented fewer surprises. For silver does not corrode significantly in seawater and can survive indefinitely at any depth, but the condition of the wooden crates in which the bars were packed revealed information about how organic materials behave in deep water environments, show that wood can persist for decades if protected from the organisms that normally consume it, demonstrated that the crates had been well constructed and properly treated, and that their design had anticipated the stresses of ocean transport, if not the stresses of sinking and prolonged submersion. Some of the crates, had broken open during the ship's descent or impact with the seafloor, spilling their contents across the sediment, and the silver bars from these broken crates lay scattered in patterns that allowed researchers to reconstruct the sequence of events during the sinking, to understand how the ship had tumbled and rolled as it fell, how the cargo had shifted and broken free from its moorings, how the various components of the wreck had come to rest in their current positions. The salvage company that discovered the wreck attempted to negotiate a recovery operation with multiple parties, including the original insurance companies that had paid claims on the cargo in the 1,940 seconds. The governments of the countries involved in the ship's final voyage, the descendants of the shipping company that had operated the vessel, and various other entities that claimed some legal interest in the wreck or its contents. But these negotiations revealed a complex web of overlapping claims and competing jurisdictions that could not be easily resolved, for maritime salvage law is built on precedents established over centuries, and those precedents were developed primarily for wrecks in shallow water or territorial seas, not for vessels lying in international waters at depths that were inaccessible until very recently. The question of who owns a shipwreck after 70 years has passed, whether the original owners retain any rights or whether abandonment has occurred, whether insurance companies that paid claims acquire ownership, or whether salvors who locate wrecks gain title through their efforts. These questions have answers that vary depending on jurisdiction and circumstances and the specific details of each case, and the wreck in the South Atlantic touched on all of these complexities simultaneously. The insurance companies that had paid claims on the silver in the 1,940 seconds argued that they had acquired ownership through subrogation, that their payment of claims had transferred the rights of the original owners to them, that they were entitled to any proceeds from salvage operations. But this argument was contested by the descendants of the shipping company, who maintained that the insurers had paid only for the loss of the cargo, not for transfer of ownership, that the ship and its contents remained the property of the company, regardless of how much time had passed, that salvage operations could not proceed without the company's consent. The salvage company, for its part, claimed that both the insurers and the shipping company had abandoned the wreck by failing to make any effort to locate or recover it during the intervening decades, that under maritime law, such abandonment transferred rights to whoever made the effort to find the wreck and bring it to public attention, that the substantial investment required to locate and survey the wreck entitled the salvage company to a significant share of any recovered cargo, regardless of what other parties might claim. These legal disputes consumed years and generated volumes of documentation and involved lawyers in multiple countries and ultimately failed to produce a resolution that satisfied all parties. And while the legal wrangling continued, the wreck remained on the ocean floor, its cargo unrecovered, its value unrealized, its fate suspended between competing claims that could not be adjudicated because the relevant laws had not anticipated the technological developments that made discovery of deep-water wrecks possible. Eventually, the various parties reached a tentative agreement that would have allowed a limited salvage operation to proceed, with the proceeds divided according to a complex formula that gave shares to the insurers and the shipping company, descendants and the salvage company, and even set aside a portion for a maritime museum that would display recovered artifacts. But this agreement fell apart when the salvage company revised its cost estimates and determined that the expense of conducting operations at such depth would exceed the value of the silver, even under optimistic assumptions about recovery, rates, and market prices. And without the prospect of profit, there was no incentive to proceed. And so the negotiations collapsed and the wreck was left undisturbed. The failure of the salvage operation, the inability to translate the discovery of valuable cargo into actual recovery and sale, reflects a fundamental shift in the economics of maritime salvage that has occurred as exploration has moved into deeper water, for the cost of working at extreme depths increases exponentially while the value of most underwater cargo remains relatively stable, and this means that many wrecks that would have been salvaged immediately if they were accessible in shallow water will never be salvaged at depths of 2 or 3 miles, that the ocean floor is becoming a permanent archive of lost cargo that exists in a documented state but remains economically inaccessible. The technology exists to recover almost anything from almost any depth, given sufficient resources and time. But the economic calculation that determines whether such recovery will actually occur has shifted decisively against salvage in most cases, and so the wrecks accumulate, and the inventory of known but unrecovered cargo grows longer, and the ocean floor becomes a museum whose exhibits can be viewed remotely but never touched. There is something profoundly strange about this situation, about living in an era when we can locate and document wrecks that previous generations could never have found but cannot justify the expense of recovering their cargo, even when that cargo is valuable, when knowledge has outpaced capability, or at least outpaced economic incentive, when the barrier to recovery is not technical impossibility but financial calculation, when we know where millions of dollars worth of silver rests on the ocean floor but cannot bring it to the surface because the cost of doing so would exceed its value. This represents a kind of post-scarcity paradox, a situation in which valuable resources exist in known locations but remain unused, because the effort required to obtain them exceeds the benefit they would provide. And while the situation may seem wasteful or irrational, it is actually a rational response to the specific conditions that govern deep-sea salvage, where the costs are certain and substantial, while the benefits are uncertain and limited. The wreck of the ship that sank in 1942 has become, in the years since its discovery, a case study cited in discussions of deep-sea salvage law and maritime archaeology and the economics of underwater recovery operations, a reference point for researchers and lawyers and salvage professionals who use it to illustrate various points about how the industry operates and what challenges it faces and what the future might hold as exploration continues to push into deeper water. The wreck appears in academic papers and legal briefs and trade publications, always described in similar terms, always used to demonstrate similar points about the gap between discovery and recovery, about the challenges of establishing ownership of long-lost cargo, about the preservation capabilities of the deep ocean, And through this repetition in specialized literature, the wreck has acquired a kind of abstract existence, separate from its physical reality, has become a concept as much as an object, a symbol of a particular set of problems and possibilities that define contemporary maritime salvage. But the wreck itself, the actual physical object resting on the ocean floor, remains unchanged by all this discussion and documentation, continues to rest in darkness 3 miles below the surface, its cargo undisturbed by the legal battles fought over ownership, its automobiles unmoved by the economic calculations that have determined they will never be recovered, its silver unaffected by the academic papers that describe its preservation. And in this indifference to human concerns, the wreck demonstrates a fundamental truth about the ocean, which is that it operates according to its own rhythms and principles, regardless of what humans might want or plan or hope, that it preserves what falls into it according to physical and chemical laws that have nothing to do with value or ownership or historical significance, that it creates an environment where artifacts can survive for centuries without serving any human purpose, without contributing to any human project, without advancing any human interest. The crew members who survived the sinking, those 47 men who made it into lifeboats and were eventually rescued, returned to their lives after the war and for the most part never spoke publicly about what had happened, honored the wartime restrictions on discussing sensitive cargo, and never violated those restrictions even after the information ceased to be classified, carried their memories privately and shared them only with family or fellow survivors at occasional reunions that grew smaller as the years passed and the men aged and died. By the time the wreck was discovered in 2011, only 3 of the survivors remained alive, men in their late 80s and early 90s who had been young sailors in 1942, and these men were contacted by researchers interested in their recollections of the sinking and the cargo and the voyage, but their memories after nearly 70 years were fragmented and uncertain, could provide some details about conditions aboard the ship and the sequence of events during the attack, but could not add much to the documentary record that already existed in official files and submarine logs and insurance claims. One of these survivors, interviewed shortly before his death in 2013, described the moment when the first torpedo struck, the way the explosion seemed to lift the entire ship and then slam it back down into the water, the sound of tearing metal and rushing water and men shouting in the darkness, the confusion and fear and the desperate scramble to reach the lifeboats before the ship went down, and he remembered vividly the sight of the stern rising out of the water as the bow sank, the propeller blades spinning uselessly in the air, the whole vessel standing nearly vertical before it slipped beneath the surface, and he remembered the silence that followed, the way the ocean seemed to swallow all sound except the lap of waves against the lifeboats and the quiet weeping of injured men, and he remembered wondering whether rescue would come and how long they could survive in the boats, and whether anyone knew where they were or would think to look for them. And these memories, recorded in an oral history archive, provide a human dimension to the story of the wreck that cannot be derived from technical surveys or legal documents or academic analyses. The survivor spoke also about the cargo, about knowing that they were carrying silver, but not knowing exactly how much or where it was being sent or why it was considered important enough to risk an Atlantic crossing without naval escort, and he recalled conversations among the crew about what would happen to the cargo if the ship were attacked, whether it would sink with the ship or float or be scattered across the ocean. And these conversations, he said, were half serious and half joking. The kind of speculation that men engage in to pass time and manage anxiety, but they stopped being hypothetical when the torpedoes hit, and suddenly the question of what happened to cargo when a ship sank became urgently relevant, though by that point no one had time to think about silver or automobiles or anything except survival. He remembered that some of the men in the lifeboats argued about whether they should try to salvage anything from the wreck site, whether there might be crates or debris floating nearby that could be useful. But these arguments were brief, because the priority was getting away from the area before the submarine surfaced or another attack occurred. And so they rowed away from the sinking ship and left everything behind, the cargo and the personal belongings and the bodies of the men who had died, and they never looked back. In the oral history interview, conducted more than 70 years after the sinking, the survivor expressed surprise that the wreck had been found, that technology had advanced to the point where ships 3 miles underwater could be located and surveyed, and when shown photographs of the automobiles still on their pallets in the cargo hold, he stared at the images for a long time without speaking, and when he finally did speak, he said only that it seemed impossible that things which had been lost so long ago should still exist somewhere, that the ocean should preserve them so perfectly. And he wondered aloud whether the cars could still be driven if they were brought to the surface and restored, and when told that recovery was considered economically unfeasible, he laughed, a short, bitter sound, and said that it figured that the cargo they had risked their lives to transport had turned out to be worthless after all, not because it lacked value, but because no one could justify the cost of recovering it. And this seemed to him a fitting conclusion to the whole affair, a final irony that confirmed his long-held belief that most of what men considered important was actually meaningless, that value was arbitrary and temporary and subject to change without notice. The survivor died 4 months after the interview was recorded, and his death reduced the number of living witnesses to the sinking to 2, and within the following year both of those men had died as well, and with their deaths the last direct human connection to the ship was severed. The last memories of what it was like to sail on her and work in her cargo, hold and feel the deck beneath one's feet disappeared. And what remains is only the documentary record, the official files and photographs and logs, and the wreck itself resting on the ocean floor as the sole surviving physical evidence of a ship that once existed, a vessel that carried men and cargo across the Atlantic until a submarine ended her career and sent her to the bottom where she has rested for more than 70 years. The death of the last survivors meant that the wreck ceased to be a living memory and became purely historical, an artifact from the past that exists only in archives and underwater surveys, and this transition, though it occurs with every historical event as the people who experienced it die and are replaced by generations who know it only through documentation, carries particular weight in the case of shipwrecks, because the physical evidence remains accessible, can still be visited and studied and photographed, creates a kind of temporal bridge between past and present that allows researchers to examine objects that were handled by people who are now dead, to see spaces that were inhabited by men whose lives ended decades ago, to observe a moment frozen in time and preserved by the ocean's cold and pressure and darkness. The wreck has been visited several times since its initial discovery, each visit conducted by remotely operated vehicles deployed from research vessels or salvage ships, and each visit has added to the cumulative knowledge about the site, has revealed details that were missed in previous surveys, has documented changes in the wreck's condition as corrosion continues and sediment accumulates, and the structure slowly collapses under its own weight and the pressure of the water above it. These repeat visits have shown that even in the deep ocean, even in conditions that seem stable and unchanging, wrecks continue to evolve, continue to deteriorate, continue to move slowly toward a state where they will be indistinguishable from the natural seafloor, and this deterioration, though occurring over timescales measured in centuries rather than years, is nonetheless inexorable, means that even the preservation capabilities of the deep ocean are not permanent, that eventually the wreck will collapse completely and the cargo will be buried in sediment and the automobiles will corrode to the point where they are no longer recognizable as vehicles, and the whole site will become just another feature of the abyssal landscape, remarkable only to researchers who know its history and can interpret the shapes and materials they observe. The question of how long the wreck will remain in its current, relatively intact state depends on numerous factors, including the specific chemistry of the water at that location, the rate of sediment deposition, the stability of the seafloor, the activity of marine organisms, and the possibility of human intervention either through salvage operations or scientific sampling, but estimates based on observations of other deep-water wrecks suggest that the ship might remain recognizable for another century or two before structural collapse becomes advanced enough to obscure its identity, and the cargo, particularly the automobiles, might survive in identifiable form even longer if they become buried in sediment that protects them from corrosion. And the silver, being chemically stable, could persist indefinitely, though the crates containing it will eventually rot away completely and the bars will be scattered across the seafloor, separated from their original configuration, transformed from a carefully organized cargo into a random distribution of metal ingots that might be mistaken for natural mineral deposits by observers who do not know the site's history. This gradual transformation from shipwreck to seafloor feature is a process that has occurred with thousands of vessels over the centuries, a process that was largely invisible until the development of deep-sea exploration technology made it possible to observe wrecks at various stages of deterioration and develop models of how the process unfolds. And what these observations have revealed is that the ocean does not simply preserve wrecks indefinitely, but rather subjects them to a slow dissolution that eventually erases most evidence of their existence, that the popular image of the seafloor as a graveyard filled with intact ships is misleading, that most wrecks more than a few centuries old have deteriorated beyond recognition, that the inventory of identifiable shipwrecks on the ocean floor represents only a small fraction of all the vessels that have been lost, the relatively recent losses that have not yet been destroyed by time and pressure and the ocean's chemistry. The ship that sank in 1942 is relatively young by these standards, has been underwater for less than a century, and so its preservation is better than that of older wrecks, Its identity is still clearly apparent, its cargo is still recognizable and documented, but given enough time, it too will follow the path of deterioration that leads eventually to disappearance, will be reduced to fragments and scattered debris, and finally to nothing, will return to the elements from which it was constructed, and the silver and the automobiles and all the other materials it carried will be dispersed and buried and lost. Not lost in the sense of being unlocatable, but lost in the sense of being indistinguishable from the natural environment, absorbed into the seafloor, recycled by geological and biological processes, erased from the physical record even as they persist in the historical record through the documents and photographs and surveys that captured their existence while they were still intact. This inevitable erasure, this guarantee that even the best preserved wrecks will eventually disappear, adds a quality of poignancy to the documentation efforts that have been directed at the wreck. For the researchers and salvage professionals who have surveyed the site know that they are recording something temporary, that the automobiles they photograph and the silver they document will not exist in their current form forever, that future generations may have access to the records of this wreck, but will not have access to the wreck itself, which will have collapsed and dispersed and been absorbed into the environment, and so the surveys and photographs and measurements acquire an archival importance beyond their immediate purpose, become not just documentation of a specific wreck, but documentation of a moment in time, a snapshot of how this particular collection of objects appeared at this particular point in their long dissolution. The deep ocean is full of such moments, full of wrecks at various stages of preservation and deterioration, full of artifacts that have been removed from human use and placed in an environment that maintains them temporarily before destroying them permanently. And as exploration continues and more wrecks are discovered and documented, the cumulative archive of underwater sites grows larger and more comprehensive, becomes a kind of parallel historical record that complements traditional archives and museums, a record maintained not by human institutions but by the ocean itself, not organized according to human categories and priorities, but distributed randomly across the seafloor according to the patterns of trade and travel and warfare that shaped maritime history. The wreck in the South Atlantic is one node in this distributed archive, one point of data in a larger pattern, one example of a type of loss that occurred thousands of times during World War II, when submarines prowled the Atlantic and sank merchant vessels with such frequency that the outcome of the war depended partly on whether the Allies could build ships faster than Germany could sink them. And the answer to that question, though ultimately favourable to the Allies, came at enormous cost. Hundreds of ships lost and thousands of men dead and millions of tons of cargo sent to the ocean floor. And most of that cargo remains there still, resting in darkness, preserved or deteriorating depending on local conditions, contributing to an underwater landscape littered with the remnants of a global conflict that reshaped human civilization. The silver in the cargo holds those 48 tons of refined metal that were being transported to India to support British financial operations, represents a tiny fraction of the precious metals that were lost at sea during the war. For dozens of ships carrying gold or silver or platinum were sunk in various theatres, and some of that metal has been recovered through salvage operations, but most remains where it fell, scattered across thousands of miles of ocean floor, removed from circulation, subtracted from the inventory of accessible resources, transformed from financial assets into underwater artifacts, and the cumulative value of this lost precious metal, if it could somehow be calculated and recovered, would amount to billions of dollars, enough to fund major development projects or support entire economies. But the economics of deep-sea salvage mean that most of it will never be recovered, will remain on the ocean floor indefinitely, known but inaccessible, valuable but useless. The automobiles represent a different kind of loss, for they have no intrinsic value as materials, being composed mostly of steel and rubber and glass that would not justify the cost of recovery even if they could be salvaged intact, and their value, if any, is historical and cultural, as examples of American industrial design from a specific period, as artifacts that document the state of automotive technology in 1942, as objects that connect the present to the past through their continued existence in recognizable form. And this kind of value, though real, is not quantifiable in economic terms, cannot be weighed against the cost of salvage operations, cannot justify the millions of dollars that would be required to bring even a single vehicle to the surface, and so they remain on their pallets in the cargo hold, museum pieces in a museum that has no visitors except remotely operated vehicles, exhibits that will never be viewed except through cameras, artifacts that document a moment in industrial history, but that serve no educational purpose because they cannot be accessed by the public they might educate. This tension between the historical value of underwater artifacts and the economic barriers to their recovery is a defining characteristic of maritime archaeology in the 21st century, shapes the decisions that researchers and salvage companies make about which sites to document and which to ignore, determines what gets preserved in museums and what remains on the ocean floor, creates a situation where the most historically significant wrecks are sometimes the ones that receive the least attention because they lie in deep water, where study is expensive and recovery impossible, while less significant sites in shallow water receive extensive documentation and salvage because they are accessible and the costs are manageable. The wreck in the South Atlantic falls into the former category, is historically significant because of its cargo and the circumstances of its sinking, but receives limited attention because the depth makes detailed study expensive, and because the impossibility of recovery means there is no commercial incentive to invest in extensive documentation. The salvage company that discovered the wreck conducted several surveys and then largely moved on to other projects, having determined that there was no profit to be made from the site and that the cost of continued documentation could not be justified without external funding, and efforts to secure such funding from museums or universities or government agencies were unsuccessful because those institutions have limited budgets and other priorities and cannot justify spending money to study a wreck never be recovered or displayed. And so the wreck has been left largely undocumented beyond the initial surveys, its story told in a few academic papers and news articles, but otherwise forgotten, displaced from public attention by more recent discoveries and more pressing concerns, allowed to fade back into obscurity despite its historical significance and the remarkable preservation of its cargo. This cycle of discovery and documentation and abandonment is typical of deep water wrecks, reflects the economic realities that govern maritime archaeology and salvage, demonstrates how sites that might in an earlier era have received extensive study and recovery efforts are now simply noted and catalogued and left undisturbed, added to databases that track known wrecks but that do not guarantee any further attention or research. And the result is that the ocean floor is becoming populated with documented but unstudied sites, wrecks whose locations are known and whose basic characteristics have been recorded, but whose full historical significance has not been explored, whose contents have not been fully inventoried, whose stories have not been completely told. The ship that sank in 1942 and was found in 2011 is one of thousands of such sites, interesting but not unique, valuable but not recoverable, historically significant but not prioritized, and it rests on the ocean floor in a state of documented abandonment, known to researchers but unstudied by them, visible through remotely operated vehicles but unseen by human eyes, preserved by the ocean but inaccessible to the institutions that might preserve it deliberately, and in this state it will likely remain for the foreseeable future, neither lost nor found, neither forgotten nor remembered, existing in a liminal space between presence and absence that characterizes so much of what lies beneath the surface of the ocean, the vast inventory of human artifacts that have been removed from the world above and deposited in the world below, where they serve no purpose except to exist, to wait, to slowly deteriorate until they are indistinguishable from the natural environment that has claimed them. And perhaps there is something appropriate about this fate, something fitting about the idea that not everything lost can be recovered, that not everything found can be saved, that the ocean keeps what falls into it and returns only what it chooses, according to principles that have nothing to do with human desires or needs, and that the wreck lying 3 miles below the surface with its cargo of silver and automobiles is exactly where it belongs, neither disturbed nor retrieved, neither exploited nor protected, simply existing in a state that requires nothing from us except acknowledgement, simply waiting in darkness that will persist long after we have forgotten it was ever there.